Hello and welcome, I'm Ellie Richardson and you're watching the World Report on NewsX World. Let's take a look at some of the top headlines of this hour. The Justice Department has unredacted names like billionaire Les Wexner, assistant Leslie Groff and modelling agent Jean-Luc Brunel as Jeffrey Epstein's co-conspirator in a 2019 FBI document. President Trump has vowed to halt the opening of the Geordie Howe International Bridge connecting Detroit and Windsor unless Canada shares ownership and compensates the US for perceived trade imbalances. The White House has updated its fact sheet on the historic US-India trade deal, removing mentions of tariff reductions on certain pulses and softening language on India's purchase commitments. The Chinese yuan has surged to its strongest level against the US dollar since May 2023, trading around 6.91 offshore, driven by a firm central bank fixing and reports of Beijing urging banks to curb US Treasuries holding. A mass shooting in Tumbler Ridge, British Columbia leaves 10 people dead, including the suspect, with over 25 injured in attacks at a high school and a nearby home. Police found 6 victims inside Tumbler Ridge Secondary School. President Donald Trump escalates tensions with Iran, threatening aggressive actions if Tehran doesn't meet US demands on nuclear and missile issues. In a recent interview, Trump stated that without a deal, the US would have to do something very tough amid ongoing talks mediated by Oman. Ukrainian President Volodymyr Zelensky intends to reveal plans for presidential elections and a peace deal referendum on February the 24th, marking the 4th anniversary of Russia's invasion. Indonesia readies up to 8,000 troops for Board of Peace efforts in Gaza. The troops will form part of the Internationalist Stabilization Forces under US President Donald Trump's Board of Peace. And we have some breaking news for you now. The National Center for Seismology has reported that an earthquake of magnitude 6 has rattled the South Pacific Ocean. The earthquake occurred with a depth of 515 kilometers. The world's greatest earthquake belt, the Circum-Pacific Seismic Belt, and is found along the rim of the Pacific Ocean, where about 81% of our planet's largest earthquakes occur, as it's earned the nickname Ring of Fire. And for some more breaking news, Russia has warned that it will take military confinements if the West increases its military presence in Greenland. Foreign Minister Sergei Lavrov issued that a threat during a speech to Russian lawmakers on February the 11th, 2026, stating that any move to militarize the territory and establish military capabilities aimed at Russia would trigger an appropriate response from Moscow, including military technical actions. This warning comes amid rising tensions over Greenland's strategic location in the Arctic, a region of growing geopolitical importance. As we know, Trump obviously wanted to have Greenland, and after many weeks of talks with Denmark's leaders and Greenland's leaders, they came to a decision. Russia has warned that it will take military confinements if the West increases its military presence in Greenland. Foreign Minister Sergei Lavrov issued the threat during a speech to Russian lawmakers on February the 11th, 2026, stating that any move to militarize the territory and establish military capabilities aimed at Russia would trigger an appropriate response from Moscow, including military technical actions. This warning comes amid rising tensions over Greenland's strategic location in the Arctic, a region of growing geopolitical importance. That it will take military countermeasures if the West increases its military presence in Greenland. Foreign Minister Sergei Lavrov issued the threat during a speech to Russian lawmakers on February the 11th, 2026, stating that any move to militarize the territory and establish military capabilities aimed at Russia would trigger an appropriate response from Moscow, including military technical actions. This warning comes amid rising tensions over Greenland's strategic location in the Arctic, a region of growing geopolitical importance. We are now being joined by Sol Sadka, who's a political commentator, joining us from Tel Aviv. Thank you so much for joining us here today. Is Russia's threat primarily defensive or part of a larger geopolitical strategy, do you think?
I don't think it's either defensive or part of a larger geopolitical strategy. It's entirely bluster. If you recall, the Russian leaders have led their people into a disastrous war in Ukraine that has bled them dry financially, it has drained their military capacity, and it has exposed them before the entire world as no superpower, but an absolute paper tiger. So how are they possibly going to make threats against other nations if they weren't even able to move more than 50 miles into Ukraine in 4 years? We are coming up to the 4th anniversary now of the start of their war, and they have absolutely failed in their war goals. So they certainly are not in any position to be making any kind of threats to move in other directions. And the reason we are seeing other countries, as we've seen in Azerbaijan and in the United States and other places that are now becoming more emboldened, the reason we're seeing that is because a lot of these countries, their rivals, have lost their primary ally, Russia, because Russia has bogged itself down in this quagmire.
And how could this dispute over Greenland from Russia's comments influence NATO unity and coercion?
Hello?
How could this dispute over Greenland influence NATO's unity and coercion? And for your next story now. I can't hear you. Qatar's Emir Sheikh Tamim bin Hamad Al Thani and US President Donald Trump held a phone call to discuss regional de-escalations and stability, as both Washington and Tehran works towards a diplomatic solution on Iran's nuclear program. The call just comes ahead of a meeting between Trump and Israeli Prime Minister Benjamin Netanyahu. In this meeting, Netanyahu is expected to push for broader talks with Iran, addressing not just its nuclear program, but also its missile capabilities and other security issues. Qatar has been actively involved in easing tensions between the US and Iran, aiming to prevent a military confrontation. Iranian advisor Ali Larijani arrived in Qatar on Wednesday, likely to meet with the Emir. These developments come after the US and Iran held indirect talks in Oman last week, which was seen as a step forward in the ongoing diplomatic dialogue. We are now being joined again by Sol Sadka. Thank you for joining us back here. What strategic role can Qatar play in the de-escalation efforts between the United States and Iran, and why is it being taped for this mediation?
Well, the reason Qatar might have been tapped for this mediation is because they harbour within their nation a number of Iranians' great allies, Hamas and so on and so forth. And so they have been trying to play a game, a good cop, bad cop game with the West for many years. And for them, it's very, very important that the Iranians still remain some kind of threat. because if the Iranians are no longer a threat, then the situation that they are in is very bad, because there will no longer be any need for American bases to the same extent in the Middle East. That means the only thing that protects Qatar from being invaded and overrun in hours by their Saudi rivals, or really in the reality as enemies, is the large American base on their territory. If that were to go away, that would be the end of Qatar. So Qatar very much wants to play the game and to try and help the Iranian regime stay in power. But my guess is that even though the Qataris do seem to have a certain amount of pull with members of the Trump administration, it won't be enough in this case, because Trump has really nailed his flags to the mast here, and the amount of military equipment building up around Iran is so great that Iran is either going to have to essentially surrender to American terms, or the regime will likely be brought down, or at least put in such a weak position that it will fall by itself in the relatively near future.
Does active diplomacy between the US and Iran, reinforced by discussions with regional partners like Qatar, does this reduce the risk of wider conflict in the Middle East?
No, not at all. Unfortunately, we have seen the results of Qatari mediation, that kind of thing, over the years. And if anything, what it's done is it's allowed various bad actors to maintain their place on the world stage and drag out what could have otherwise been very short conflicts. But who knows? If Qatar can persuade Iran that it's in their interest to accept the American ultimatums in full, then perhaps, as Qatar was in fact able, once Qatar realized that their Hamas beneficiaries were no longer an asset to them at all and were simply a bad stain on their reputation, they managed to persuade Hamas, against Hamas's own interest, to hand over all the hostages, and that happened. So who knows? Perhaps Qatar really does have the clout to force the Iranians to capitulate. But that's only going to happen if Qatar thinks it's in their interest for that to happen. And my guess is they don't yet think that, so probably that won't happen. And even if they are able to bring Iran to the table and try and force their hand, there's no certainty that there is sufficient unity within the Iranian regime. There are all sorts of factions, hardliners, people that really want to go down with the ship, whereas there are also more pragmatic people who are relatively fundamentally secular in some ways, who would like to make deals. And those have always been in play. It could be so that even if Qatar is able to bring Iran to the table, the Iranians will not be able to unite sufficiently to accept any deal.
Thank you so much, Saul, for joining us here today on NewsX World. Thailand's Elections Commission is facing pressure over an alleged lack of transparency in vote counting across more than a dozen constituencies, following Sunday's general election that was swept by Prime Minister Anutin Charnavakurilu's party. Almost immediately after polls closed at 10 o'clock GMT on Sunday, members of the People's Party flagged irregularities in the vote count on social media. These included videos showing ballots being counted in the dark, valid votes incorrectly marked as spoiled, and discrepancies between figures recorded at polling stations and those entered into the Election Commission's online system. The People's Party, which led most pre-election polls but came in at a distant second behind Anutin's Boma Jathi party, said it accepted the results but has sought recounts in 18 constituencies. We are now being joined by Dr. Satoru Nagao, who's a fellow Hudson Institute, joining us from Tokyo. Thank you so much for joining us here today. What are the main transparency concerns surrounding Thailand's election commission, and how might they affect public trust in the election results?
In this case, before the elections, most of the elections, maybe the most seats divided in the one side, one side, one side in the ruling party and the two opposition parties. So that's why it will happen again, the people expect it. And view from the survey, there's a possibility one of the opposition party could be the biggest party in the parliament, people expect it. But after the election, people realized the ruling party got relatively big. Even if not majority, but at the same time, more than one third they got, and so that's why people start to doubt why it has happened. And in this case, such kind of information has revealed. After that, people do not trust the result of the election, and that has happened as a scandal. But at the same time, without certain evidence, this kind of the incident as a partial influence towards the election, people can believe. So that's why it will happen rely on what kind of explanation government will do. And if this is a proper election, of course, even if this is a proper election, the governmental party hasn't got a majority. This means that anyway they need to ally with the opposition party, and this means that opposition party still has an influence in the Thailand politics. So that's why this is not perfectly controlled by someone. This is still a valuable election, I think.
And how do allegations of irregularities, like they said about counting in the dark, etc., how do these irregularities in vote counting or reporting shape perceptions in democratic legitimacy in Thailand?
Of course, view from the legitimacy, such kind of scandal is not good, of course, because if this is just one incident, not common incident, in this case, people can believe the result of the election. But if this incident is just a part of the big eyes, so that's why, in this case, people cannot trust the election. So that's why legitimacy is damaged by this kind of activities, scandal. So how wide this scandal is will be decisive of the trustworthy or not. That is true.
Thank you. Don't go too far, as we will be back with you very shortly. Some more breaking news. Indian Prime Minister Narendra Modi has expressed his deep shock over the horrific shooting incident in Canada. In his statement, Modi extended heartfelt condolences to the families who have lost loved ones and wished for a speedy recovery for those injured. He added that India stands in solidarity with the people of Canada during this tragic time. 9 people have been confirmed dead and at least 25 others have been injured following shootings at a school and a nearby residence in Tumbler Ridge, British Columbia. And some more breaking news. Taiwan plans to send a team to the US to assess rare earth deposits, aiming to refine these minerals on the island. Taiwan's Economy Minister Kong Ming-Hsan has said the assessment will determine which rare earth elements and the US had and whether they meet Taiwan's needs. With Taiwan's reliance on China for its supply chain, the move comes amid growing concerns over reliance on Beijing. Taiwan consumes 1,500 metric tons of rare earth minerals annually, and the goal is to meet half of its demand domestically by expanding production capacity. This will help secure Taiwan's future supply chain. We are now being joined again by Dr. Satoru Nagao. Thank you so much for joining us back here for this breaking news story. What does Taiwan's decision to assess US rare earth deposits reveal about the changing global supply chain priorities and how might this reshape economic security ties between Taipei, Washington and other partners?
Yeah, it is interesting, especially the focusing on, especially related with semiconductor production. Because United States weapons rely on the advanced level of the semiconductor. In this case, Taiwan supplies this semiconductor. But to produce this advanced level semiconductor, Taiwan rely on the supply chain of rare earths. And so if Taiwan rely on China to get the rare earths to produce advanced level semiconductor for the United States, this means that indirectly United States rely on China. Even if this weapon, U.S. weapon, is the purpose of this weapon is against fight against China, so that's why this is ironically the situation, and the U.S. need to solve, Taiwan need to solve. So firstly, the U.S. and Taiwan are negotiating relocate factory of the semiconductor from Taiwan to United States, and some certain part of the factories will relocate to the United States. But even if under such kind of situation, still this semiconductor factory rely on the supply chain, rare supply chain from China. So this means that this is not an effective way to deal with China. So that's why Taiwan and the United States need to find alternative source of rare earths. Without this, this is not an effective way as an economic security. So that's why this issue is very important now. And both US and Taiwan want to find alternative source, and especially if the factory is located in the United States. In this case, if Taiwan finds supply chain in the United States, that is proper.
Thank you, Dr. Satura. Don't move too far, as we will be back with you very shortly. The Philippine Foreign Ministry has urged the Chinese embassy to take a more constructive approach amid rising tensions. Newly appointed spokesperson Rogelio Villanueva emphasised that responses should be made in a calm and professional manner. This call follows the Philippine Senate's approval of a resolution condemning the Chinese embassy's remarks on the country's maritime sovereignty in the South China Sea. Meanwhile, China rejected the resolution, labelling it a political stunt. Diplomatic relations between the two nations have been increasingly strained due to ongoing maritime confrontations. However, Philippine Ambassador to the United States, Jose Romualdez, highlighted the importance of cooling tensions, stressing that the relationship should not be defined solely by maritime dispute. We are now being joined again by Dr. Satura Nagal. Thank you for joining us back here. Why is the Philippines asking China to keep its tone calm right now?
View from the military balance, the Philippines wished a peaceful situation with China. But at the same time, China side do not share the same opinion because they are stronger, they believe. And in this case, the Philippines wish to be peace means that the Philippines should follow China. That is the logic China has. And in this case, especially under the situation which is US-China relation is not so escalated, high tension. But under such kind of situation, China can be bold against other US allies and partners because US is not the main threat. If the U.S. is a big threat against China, in this case, China want to focus on U.S. Instead of the rising tension with the United States. China's policy towards other U.S. allies and partners is relatively calm. But completely opposite has happened just now. The U.S. and China, the tension is not so high. So that's why China is becoming the bold against Japan, against Taiwan, against Philippines, something like that. So Philippines diplomacy always Philippines try to choose a soft stance against China because they do not wish a conflict with China. But China is not so peaceful country and every time provoke Philippines, especially that their relation with the US is not so high tense in this case. High tension in this case, China is becoming bold and provoke Philippines. That could happen. So Philippines want to make peace, and China is not.
Thank you, Dr. Sturanagal, for joining us here today on NewsX World. Here for some more breaking news for you. At least 9 people have been killed in Madagascar after tropical cyclone Gezani slammed into the Indian Ocean island, bringing winds of more than 195 kilometers per hour. The cyclone made landfall in the eastern port city of Tomanazia, causing widespread destruction. Buildings collapsed, roofs were torn off, power lines were brought down, and trees were unrooted. Madagascar's National Office for Risk and Disaster Management confirmed at least 19 people were injured, most due to structural damage caused by the storm. Red alerts were issued for several regions amid fears of flooding and landslides. The storm later weakened into a tropical system as it moved westwards across the country, passing north of the capital, Antananarivo, which remains under flood alert. The disaster comes less than 2 weeks after another cyclone killed 14 people. A tragic incident has unfolded in Papua, Indonesia, as a civilian plane came under attack. Police has reportedly confirmed that the pilot and co-pilot of the smart airplane were shot and killed after an unknown assailant fired upon the aircraft during its landing at the Kroain airport located in Boven Diogel region of South Papua. The small commercial flight carrying 13 passengers had just touched down at 11:17 a.m. local time when the shooting started. As the attack began, the pilots and passengers evacuated the plane, fleeing into nearby forested land. All passengers are reported safe, though the 2 crew members tragically lost their lives. The motive and the identity of these attacks remain unclear, with no claims of responsibility. There has been speculation about possible involvement of separatist rebel groups amid ongoing tensions in the region. Papua, rich in resources, has long been at the centre of conflict between local independence fighters and Indonesian security forces. The Kremlin says the messaging app Telegram must comply with Russian law or face further restrictions. Kremlin spokesperson Dmitry Peskov has stated that the state communications regulator is required to act if the platform fails to respond to official requests. He added that Telegram has not corrected previous violations and that could lead to tighter measures. The warning signals growing pressure on digital platforms operating inside Russia. That's all we have time for this hour. Keep watching NewsX.